Everyone, welcome back to another lecture of AP Government and Politics. In this lecture, I'm gonna go over the historical background of the National Emergency Act of 1976. So just make sure, and you can certainly refer to the actual text of the act on the website in the resources page. So when you go on the web quest, just make sure you go to the resources page and you'll be able to see that particular the text of the National Emergency Act in the resources section. So let's move on. So a brief little introduction. So the act was enacted on September 14th, 1976, and it was signed into law by President Gerald Ford, which is right pictured to my right. It mainly empowers the president to activate special powers during a crisis, but also imposes procedural formalities when acting on those powers. The powers in the act are only limited to 136 emergency powers that Congress has defined by the law. So Congress, although the Congress did make the law back in 1976, they made the limitations on what the emergency powers are, that the president can use, quote unquote, presidential powers presidential powers in order to call in a national emergency. So a few fast facts here. So since February of 2019, so even today, there have been 59 national emergencies declared, and actually 30 of those emergencies are still in effect today. So there's this continuation of national emergencies being enacted today, and I will have a link so that you can see all the national emergencies that have actually been enacted since the time that it was passed by Congress in 1976. So the first national emergency, I like to call it the first unofficial national emergency, was enacted on February 15th, 1917 by President Woodrow Wilson, which is shown here on the right. The emergency was promoted because of the United States Shipping Board, and Wilson actually stated that I have found that there exists a national emergency arising from the insufficiency of maritime tonnage to carry the products of the farms, forests, mines, and manufacturing industries of the United States to their consumers abroad and within the United States. So if you paid attention to my previous lectures about the Constitution, you can certainly, this quote screams interstate commerce, right? So there's this thing, if that the country is not able to regulate and do their interstate commerce, then everything is just to a screeching halt. So almost 60 years later, now you have the first congressional where a president can actually declare a national emergency. And my humble belief is the reason why he declared this emergency is he probably looked at Supreme Court cases and how the Supreme Court ruled in moments and times of interstate commerce, and Woodrow Wilson felt the need to declare a national emergency when interstate commerce cannot go on as business as usual. Now, here is a timeline of events of the National Emergency Act. So, in 1933, if you even looking at the year, we're almost at the brink of World War I and the Great Depression, and here in this instance, President FDR asserted the power to declare emergencies without limiting their scope or duration. The Supreme Court in Youngstown Sheet and Tube Co. versus Sawyer ruled by not limiting the emergency declaration of power. So there was, if I will kind of do a brief summary of this Supreme Court case a little bit later once we get a little bit deeper into the Constitution. But this Supreme Court case had to do with interstate commerce in this instance, and it also had to do with presidential powers. So FDR used his power he asserted his power to declare a national emergency even before there was such thing as a national emergency, just even based on their interpretation of the Constitution. And then 4 years later, in 1937, the Senate had actually kind of investigated the declared emergencies that had already took into an effect from 1933 to 4 times that the Senate actually investigated 4 separate times. And so in 1933, they looked at the banking crisis with respect to the hoarding of gold. So we're talking World War I here at this point, and we're ushering into World War II here. And rightfully so, you have this banking crisis, after surviving the Great Depression. The Congress didn't want to make the same mistakes, and they didn't want to have another Great Depression. So in 1950, the emergency with respect to the Korean War. In 1970, the postal workers strike, and 1971, the response to inflation. And as you can tell, most of these were for the purpose of restricting trade with certain entities under the National Emergency Economic Powers Act in 1977, which actually gives the president power to regulate commerce after declaring a national emergency in response to any unusual and extraordinary threat to the United States has a foreign source, which was actually signed by Jimmy Carter, and he is right here. There's Jimmy Carter, and he was actually the first one, and with Jimmy Carter. Now, the very first official national emergency act that was enacted after it had been drafted by Congress was the Iran hostage crisis. So here's this little New York Times article, and basically, as you can see, is that Reagan takes oath as 40th president, promises an era of national renewal. He fulfilled that promise. And then minutes later, 52 U.S. hostages in Iran fly to freedom after a 444-day ordeal. So this was the first national crisis. So obviously, exigent circumstances take place when a president needs to enact a national emergency. It could be like a terrorist attack. It could be an economic downturn. It could be a biochemical hazard situation going on. Many things can happen. So in the next one, and sometimes you can even I don't know, maybe this could ever be an instance, and I hope not, but having a sitting president, maybe having to declare a national emergency for the assassination of a president, especially when that person is remaining at large. And that's where kind of DEFCON 1, DEFCON 2, those types of things kind of take place. So obviously moving on, so obviously for every rule or law, there are exceptions to that rule in law. So the exceptions were, and here they are, there are a few of them. We'll go over them. Number 1, allowing exemption of national defense contracts from competitive bidding, regulating the promotion, retirement, and separation of military officers, regulating transactions in foreign gold and silver, regulating federal property purchases and contracts, limiting the assignment of claims against the federal government, and enabling the president to make national defense contracts outside the otherwise applicable laws. So if you can really kind of see the pattern here of these exceptions, you can see they have everything to do when it comes to the military. That's kind of given to Congress. As far as regulating money and gold, that's also a Congress thing. You see all these exceptions to the rules. And you see why, because all these other types of these exceptions are pretty much given to the powers of Congress, right? I mean, that's Article 1 of the Constitution, where it's like, yeah, these all of these exceptions are what we call, what I previously said in other lectures. These are enumerated powers. Now, emergency powers. So, it's suspending all laws regulating chemical and biological weapons, including the ban of human testing, suspending any Clean Air Act implementation plan or excess emissions penalty upon petition of a state governor. So we're kind of getting into state issues here. Authorizing and constructing military construction projects, using any existing defense appropriations for such military constructions. So I would say constructions, I would have to say like a military, like the military going into Iraq and they build a military fort or a military base. So that'll be a emergency power. Drafting any retired Coast Guard officers and enlisted members into active duty. So, listing people saying, oh my gosh, we're in this big old war, we got to drive more people. So, this might be even something a president might do even in World War I or World War II. It's like, oh my gosh, we need all these military officers, the armed forces, because we're running out and we're losing a lot of men and we need more forces, we need more manpower. Go, go, go. So this could be an instance where you have to do that. And then, obviously, as you can tell, a lot of presidents, they have used the National Emergency Act, and some of them have used them more than once. So Jimmy Carter used his twice. He's in the top middle. Reagan, he used his 6 times. I would assume he did this a lot of times on the war on drugs and also Berlin. So when that famous speech, he went to Berlin, tear down this wall. George H.W. Bush, Reagan is actually top left. George H.W. Bush, he is the bottom second from the left. And he did that 4 times. So he was part of the Gulf War. So he did that a lot during his time. Bill Clinton, he was top right, the top right hand corner. George W. Bush, bottom third to your left. He actually, obviously he did it for 9/11, rightfully so. Barack Obama, obviously, bottom first one to your left. He did his for 13 times. That's crazy. And then Donald Trump, bottom to the very, very right-hand corner, the bottom right. He's enacted it 4 times. So you can think of it like he's at least on average enacted it once a year during his term of his presidency right now. So this concludes the historical background of the National Emergency Act of 1976. I hope this helps you as you go through your web quest to get a brief understanding of the historical background of it. I highly recommend that you read the actual text of the act to see what powers Congress gives to the president in compared to Article 2 of the Constitution, to see, well, based on the powers that are already given by the founders in Article 2 of the Constitution and what Congress has already given to the president, does the president have more powers? Is the National Emergency Act so broad in nature that presidents can enact national emergency 17 times? So bear those things in mind as you're going through your project and you're going through the web quest and understanding the Constitution and the branches of government. If you have any questions, you can certainly message me on Study Island, and I'll be happy to help you and assist you. And I hope you have fun in the web quest and that you're learning. And I hope I am making the Constitution fun. And have a great day. Bye.